Hi, and welcome back to the African Cinema Podcast. I'm your host, Tendai, and today we are diving deep into one of the most complex and fascinating chapters in South African film history. Basically, we'll be looking at the apartheid period between 1948 to 1994. This is a time where art, politics, and society collided, creating a very cinematic landscape that was both brilliant and quite deeply troubled. Now, in the first episode, we covered the roots of South African cinema. And in the second episode, we take up the story in 1948. At this point, the National Party had just come into power in South Africa, and apartheid is also about to become the law of the land. At the same time, something remarkable is happening in South African cinema. Cecil Kelawe becomes the first South African actor nominated for an Academy Award for his role in The Luck of the Irish. It's a moment of international recognition, but it's also deeply ironic because for the next 46 years, South African cinema would become increasingly isolated from the world stage. This tension between artistic achievement and political oppression would define South African cinema for nearly half a century. Today, we'll explore how filmmakers navigated this complex landscape, how the apartheid system shaped what stories could be told, and how cinema became a tool of oppression and a weapon of resistance. The late 1940s and the early 1950s were in many ways the golden age of early South African cinema. In 1949, Pierre de Wet's Kom Saam Vanand, South Africa's first musical film, became a massive box office success. Starring Al Debo and Frederick Berger, it represented something uniquely South African, sung in Afrikaans, and celebrated by white audiences across the country. But here's where things get interesting and quite complicated. The same year, Donald Swanson released Jim Goes to Joburg, featuring South Africa's first all-black cast. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a statement about urban black life in South Africa. The film showed African characters as complex human beings with their own stories, dreams, and struggles. Think about the significance of this moment. We are in 1950, Nkosi Africa, what would later become part of South Africa's national anthem, was performed by a choir on film for the first time in the movie Zonk. They weren't just cultural moments, they were quite political ones, captured on celluloid just as apartheid was becoming entrenched. The early 1950s also saw remarkable technical achievements. Jamie Uys released Dade in the Bolsford in 1951, South Africa's first color film. But perhaps more significantly, that same year saw the release of Zoltan Koda's adaptation of Cry, the Beloved Country, based on Alan Patton's groundbreaking novel. This film, starring Canada Lee and a young Sidney Poitier and Dr. Leon Ngakane as assistant director, represented something unprecedented, a serious, international, recognized film about racial injustice in South Africa. And in 1956, something happened that would fundamentally change South African cinema forever. The government introduced a regulated subsidy system that rewarded box office success. On the surface, this seemed like support for the film industry, but in reality, it was a sophisticated form of cultural control. And here's how it worked. If your film made a certain amount of money at the box office, you could get a percentage of your production costs back from the government, which sounds quite reasonable, right? But here's the catch. The system was designed to favor films that appealed to white audiences, particularly Afrikaans-speaking ones. And the results were dramatic. Between 1956 and 1962, 60 films were made in South Africa. Most were in Afrikaans, only 4 were bilingual, and just 13 were in English. The government and big business had effectively collaborated to keep South African cinema a cinema for whites only. Many of these films were what we might generously call B-grade entertainment, which were screen adaptations of popular Springbok radio programs like Taxi and The Men from the Ministry. They weren't high art, but they served a purpose. They reinforced a particular vision of South African identity that was white, often Afrikaans, and completely divorced from the reality of the majority of South Africans. This period also saw the establishment of key industry players. In 1957, a company called Inribelage was established, later renamed Ster Films. And by 1959, African Film Productions was bought out by 20th Century Fox and renamed South African Screen Productions. The industry was becoming more professional, more lucrative, and even more controlled. In 1963, the Publications Control Board, essentially the apartheid government's censorship arm, was established. This wasn't just about preventing unsuitable content, it was about controlling the narrative of South African life. The same year, something remarkable happened that would change this control. Trudy Paul directed Diamond in Didonka, the first local film directed by a woman. Though it might seem like a small step, but in the context of apartheid South Africa, where women's voices were often marginalized, it represented a significant breakthrough. The tensions between artistic expression and political control became even more apparent in 1964. Cy Enfeld's Zulu was a worldwide success, but it was banned for screening to black audiences in South Africa. And just think about the absurdity of this. A film about African history made in Africa banned from being seen by Africans. The same year, Elmo DeWitt's Debbie ran into trouble with censors. Based on a book called Kroin Koring, about a farm girl who gets pregnant in the city, the film was deemed too risque because it showed an Afrikaans girl getting pregnant out of wedlock. At this point, the censors weren't just controlling political content, they were enforcing a particular moral vision that was deeply conservative and deeply patriarchal. But filmmakers were beginning to push back. In 1967, Jans Rautenbach and Emily Nofal released Wild Season, a film that dealt with generational conflict between a traditional fisherman and his educated son. It wasn't overtly political, but it was exploring the tensions within Afrikaner society itself. And even more boldly, their film Die Kandidat became South Africa's first political thriller, questioning the very boundaries of Afrikaans identity. These filmmakers were now using cinema to explore uncomfortable truths about South African society. " 1969 was a pivotal year in South African cinema, marked by the release of Katrina, a film that dared to explore love across the color line. Directed by Jans Rautenbach and produced by Emily Nofal, Katrina told the story of a colored doctor and a white woman who fell in love. It wasn't just controversial, it was actually quite dangerous. At a time where the Immorality Act made interracial relationships illegal, making a film about interracial love was an act of profound courage. Rautenbach was taking on the core ideological foundations of apartheid, which believed in racial separation, and he was doing it through the most popular medium of the time. What makes Katrina particularly fascinating is how it was made. It was filmed in Paarl and Cape Town, and the movie featured the invisible people of apartheid South Africa, black and colored South Africans in the background. The film showed the sanitized version of these communities that white audiences might expect, but it still made them visible in ways that mainstream cinema rarely did. The same year saw the formation of the Kineka organization, which would become one of the dominant forces in South African cinema distribution. By 1969, Afrikaner capital, particularly through the insurance company SANLAM, had gained significant control over the industry. This wasn't just about business, it was about ensuring that cinema remained aligned with apartheid ideology. The 1970s brought a new level of systematic racial segregation to South African cinema. The so-called Bantu film industry was created, a separate, inferior system for black audiences. These films were of poor quality, made in ethnic languages, and screened in churches, schools, and beer halls rather than proper cinemas. This segregation wasn't accidental. It was designed to reinforce racial hierarchies. White audiences got Hollywood blockbusters and locally produced films in proper cinemas. Black audiences got cheaply made films in substandard venues. The message was clear: different races deserved different qualities of entertainment. But the same decade also saw the emergence of more sophisticated political cinema. Films like Bosman and Lena, made in 1973, directed by Ross Devenish, became the first feature film to honestly portray the poverty and forced removals of people classified as being black. It won gold and silver medals at the Atlanta Film Festival, proving that South African cinema could achieve international recognition when it told truthful stories. Perhaps more significantly, 1974 saw the release of Udeliwe, directed by Simon M. Sabela, the first locally produced film directed by a black person. Sabela starred in his own film alongside a young Joe Mafela. This was groundbreaking, not just artistically but politically. It proved that black South Africans could tell their own stories, control their own narratives, and create cinema that spoke to their experiences. The decade also saw the birth of television in South Africa in 1976, which would fundamentally change the entertainment landscape. Many filmmakers rushed into television production, with the SABC becoming a major hub of content creation. The late 1970s brought South African cinema to international attention in ways that were both celebrated and controversial. Ross Devenish's The Guest won the Locarno Film Festival in 1977, becoming one of the most acclaimed South African films ever made. Based on the life of writer Eugene Marais, it starred Athol Fugard and dealt with themes of addiction, mental illness, and suicide, heavy topics that showed the maturity of South African filmmaking. Marigolds in August, which was made in 1979, also directed by Devenish, won awards at film festivals in Berlin and Russia. These films proved that South African cinema could compete on the world stage when it tackled serious themes with artistic integrity. But the biggest international success was also the most problematic. This would come at the start of the 1980s. Jamie Oyos's The Gods Must Be Crazy, made in 1980, became a global phenomenon. But it was also deeply problematic in its representation of the Khoisan people. The film's successes masked serious ethical issues. None of the Khoisan actors ever received royalties, and the film perpetuated stereotypes about indigenous Africans that were both demeaning and exploitative. This tension between international success and ethical filmmaking would continue to haunt South African cinema throughout the apartheid period. The 80s represented a fascinating paradox in South African cinema. On one hand, generous tax concessions led to a boom in commercial filmmaking, with several hundred films being made, mostly inferior imitations of American movies. On the other hand, a powerful underground cinema emerged that was highly critical of apartheid. Films like The Road to Mecca, The Fourth Reich, and Darryl Rolt's trilogy Place of Weeping, The Stick, and Jobman represented a new kind of South African cinema. These were films that directly challenged apartheid ideology, often at great personal and professional risk to their creators. Place of Weeping, which was released in 1984, was particularly significant. Directed by Darryl Rodet and produced by Anant Singh, it was the first anti-apartheid motion picture to be made entirely in South Africa. Singh personally financed the film, taking enormous financial and political risks. The film received worldwide acclaim and was the only South African film to play on HBO in the United States. But here's the tragic irony. These films, which told the truth about South African society, were barely seen by South Africans themselves. The major distribution companies, Ster-Necker and New Metro, refused to screen them. Instead, they were distributed through a handful of independent venues and were more widely seen overseas in their country of origin. The most powerful of these resistance films was 1987 film Mapantsula, directed by Oliver Schmitz. This was the first anti-apartheid feature film for and about black South Africans. It told the story of a small-time criminal who becomes politicized while in prison with political activists. The film won 7 South African Film Awards but was initially banned within South Africa itself. As the 80s drew to a close, South African cinema began to reflect the changing political landscape. The government acknowledged that there were insufficient funds to continue financing the old subsidy system, and new forms of cinema began to emerge. The early 1990s saw several significant co-productions that suggested a new future for South African cinema. Darryl Roth's Cry the Beloved Country, which was again released in 1995, though it was produced earlier, Elaine Proctor's Friends and other films began to explore themes of reconciliation and transformation. But perhaps the most significant film of this period was Sarafina, which was made in 1992. Directed by Darryl Roth and produced by Anant Singh, starring Leleti Kumalo, Miriam Makeba, and Whoopi Goldberg, the film told the story of the 1976 Soweto uprisings. Shot on location in Soweto, it was based on the stage production by Mbongeni Ngema and grossed $8 million in the United States. Sarafina was important, not just as a film but as a symbol. It showed that South African stories could achieve international success when they were told honestly and with artistic integrity. It also demonstrated that Black South African artists could be the protagonists of their own stories, not just background characters in white narratives. Now, as we look back at South African cinema from 1948 to 1994, we see a cinema that was deeply shaped by apartheid ideology, and also a cinema that was often excluded, stereotyped, or marginalized the majority of South Africans. The subsidy system, the censorship board, and the distribution networks all worked to ensure that cinema reinforced rather than challenged the apartheid system. But we also see remarkable examples of resistance, creativity, and artistic courage. Filmmakers like Jans Rautenbach, Ross Devenish, Oliver Schmitz, and Darryl Roth found ways to tell truthful stories about South African society, often at great personal and professional risks. Black filmmakers like Simon Sabela and Gibson Kete broke barriers and created space for African voices in South African cinema. Perhaps most importantly, we see how cinema became a battleground for competing visions of South African identity. Every film was, in some sense, a political statement. Whether it supported or challenged the apartheid system, whether it included or excluded African voices, whether it told comfortable lies or uncomfortable truths. The story of South African cinema during apartheid teaches us that art is never quite neutral. Cinema doesn't just reflect society, it actively shapes how we understand ourselves and our world. The filmmakers who chose to challenge apartheid through their art weren't just making movies, they were participating in the struggle for a more just and equal society. As South Africa entered the democratic era in 1994, cinema would face new challenges and opportunities, but the foundation had already been laid. Not just in terms of technical skill and industry infrastructure, but in terms of tradition of cinematic storytelling that could grapple with the complexities of South African society. The cameras had been rolling through the apartheid years, capturing not just entertainment, but a complex historical record of society in transition. Okay, so that's our deep dive into the South African cinema from 1948 to 1994. And next week, we'll be exploring the cinema of post-apartheid South Africa to basically maybe 2025. Look at how filmmakers grappled with the challenge of the new democracy. And until then, keep watching, keep questioning, and keep celebrating the power of African cinema. Ciao.